Hi, come on in. So yeah, the topic that I've chosen is the corset, which is an article of clothing. So basically kind of underwear. And I hope it'll give you an idea about how we approach academic work. We go deeply into something fairly narrow. People say, he's going to give a whole lecture on a piece of underwear? Is this even possible? Okay, how could that, work out? But as we go through this, I think you'll see that I'm not the first person who's kind of approached this topic, and there's a lot of research done on it. There's a lot of thinking about what's the kind of symbology. The picture in itself sort of suggests that there's something more going on than just a piece of clothing. You can see how this woman's waist is unnaturally narrow, and what is this? What's going on here? At first sight, I want to see it in relation to the straitjacket that we were talking about when it came to madness. So, is it related to the straitjacket in some way? Is it a way of kind of oppressing women? Was it a source of mental and physical suffering? And how much of that suffering, if there was such suffering, how much of it was a sort of intentional cruelty? How much of it was a sort of misguided way of thinking? What was going on, and what can this simple piece of clothing tell us about the way people were thinking about women, how women were related to male society, and what's going on here? So yes, this on the top left here, this is a straitjacket, and in mental hospitals, even today, they're sometimes used, but as we saw before Christmas in the class on madness, the straitjacket and other forms of physical constraint were typical when dealing with people who were said to be mad. And women were, I think, more than twice as likely to be considered mad during that period as men were. So it's obviously got some sort of gender relation. If you look at it from modern eyes, you think, well, yes, but it's not such a big step, is it, from that, to that? They both look like forms of oppression, and they're both largely used, or very, disproportionately applied to women. So there's a kind of supposition that the corset is equally a form of kind of oppression. So that's what I want to examine today. Is that a reasonable way of looking at things, or what happens when we dig below the surface? What happens when we explore this topic more deeply? So yeah, that's basically where we're going today. Okay. Well, just being very practical about it, they hadn't yet gone round to designing a bra to support just the sort of upper area. They only had the idea of this garment that sort of covered this whole area. So it was one of the basic reasons why they were wearing this. Because until the late 19th century, the idea of just something to support the breast wasn't there. So in a sense, it grew out of providing support for the, for the chest area, for the breasts. But it obviously had more to it than that. They'd been worn for hundreds of years. They'd been around for a long time. But it was really when they started making eyelets of bone or ivory, the little, the lace goes through little holes. Once those holes started to be made of very hard material, they were able to tighten the cords so that, if this eyelet area that you can see at the top left here, if it was made of soft, if it was just made of regular material, there'd be a limit to how tight they could draw it without breaking the material. But once they started using these kinds of hard things, then you ended up with sort of with that, okay, sort of excessive kind of stretching, so that women were kind of forcing their bodies so that they'd meet a sort of certain paradigm of supposed female beauty. And sometimes it's said that these corsets were also known as stays and also known as bodices. They have three names. They were sometimes, modern researchers, commentators, sometimes claim that, well, in the Victorian period, they believed it was doing them good. In other words, the doctors were, and the male society, because remember all the doctors were men, were sort of selling the idea of, you know, you should wear this, it's good for your health. Well, I haven't really found that in my own attempts to look at the research. When I look at the original kind of publications and texts from the period, well, Victorian period and before the Victorian period, during the 18th and 17th centuries even, what I'm finding is that the literature is hostile, that doctors are saying this is not good for your health, but women are wearing them anyway. So in 1653, which is pretty early from our point of view, going right back to the middle of the 17th century, you've got one doctor writing like this. He's saying that there's a foolish affectation in young virgins. Though grown big enough to be wiser, they're old enough to know better. They are led blindfold by a custom to a fashion pernicious beyond imagination, an extremely bad custom, who, thinking a slender waist a great beauty, strive all they possibly can by straight-lacing themselves to attain unto a wand-like smallness of waist. So even in the 17th century, this was starting to be something that doctors were noticing, never thinking themselves fine in the sense of thin enough, until they can span the waist, meaning they can put their hands, actually touch around the waist, which I suppose is an exaggeration. I don't suppose anybody's waist could ever actually be that small. By which deadly artifice they shut up their waists in a whalebone prison. They open the door to consumptions. Well, he was wrong about the consumptions. Consumptions is, tuberculosis. That's a virus. It's not caused by. Clothing. Doctors were against corsets. His first example we get is in 1653. By the 19th century, it's typical. So you get the London Magazine, for example, that's got an article called The Philosophy of Dress, Exercise and Sleep. And it says, again, wise people know that the artificial methods which are practiced to improve, inverted commas, they don't think it's really improving, to improve the forms of our beautiful country women, are more frequently detrimental, negative, than beneficial, positive. And that they even contribute in some instances to the production of actual deformity. Okay? Wise people, clever people, all right? People who know better, know that the corset is not a healthy thing to wear. So, doctors are not actually recommending this to women to wear. The article actually is quite interesting because it contrasts these practices of highly educated Europeans with Eastern countries which are famed for the luscious beauty of their women. And in those countries, the most loose and unencumbered dresses are worn. So it's making a contrast sorry, that bag's in your way, isn't it? Making a contrast between the supposed, when it says highly educated Europeans, it's being ironic. Supposedly, we're supposed to be so sophisticated and so educated, but if you go to Eastern countries, people are wearing much more civilized, healthy clothing, better for women. So, come on. Goes on to say, by these means, a perfect freedom of the limbs and an easy and graceful carriage of the body are ensured, while every part of the frame is allowed to reach its maturity without any interference or obstruction from the coercive, the forceful measures of art. It's not in favour of forcing women or forcing their bodies at all. And this is quite typical from the publications of that period. It's not actually saying, go on women, you wear your corsets, it's good for you. It's actually saying, no, you should stop doing this. You should be more like the women in the East who wear these graceful dresses that give their body freedom of movement and allow them to develop naturally. That's the healthy way. Not that. Okay? And again, you see enough pictures showing the negative side. That is the healthy way. They're looking obviously at Turkey and more like the Middle East, and saying, our civilization is doing this to women. It's not healthy. We're supposed to be more advanced than them, but actually they've got it right and we've got it wrong. Okay, so that's the way that they're putting it across. And I found that kind of comment quite frequent in the literature of the period. And they also, in the same article, for example, you get a comparison with Chinese footbinding, where the foot would be bound pretty much at birth. The toes would be forced upwards here. The whole foot would be deformed from its natural position and shape. And comparing what happened when you used the corset, that it was the same sort of deformation of the body. Actually saying, that it was worse. Charles Caldwell described corsets as an alarming evil. And he says that while the females of China compress and disfigure their feet, Western women compress and disfigure a portion of the system infinitely more important, that they're damaging their central kind of body system. The feet, it might be painful, but it's only the feet, he's saying. He's actually saying, what we're doing is worse than what the Chinese do with their foot binding. I have to say that he's wrong. I mean, Chinese foot binding was a very deforming thing. The corset was probably not as damaging to health as some of the more alarmist doctors of the time said it was. But the message is that they are saying that the corset was a damaging thing. It's also quite interesting that they talk about China and Turkey and places like that, and make those kinds of comparisons, because it sort of puts it in the context of colonial discourse, where it's actually saying that the Europeans are not treating their women any better than the Eastern nations that they normally look down on, and sometimes they're actually treating them worse, which is kind of more closer to modern feminist and post-colonial discourse, where instead of automatically assuming that the European is superior, there's a sort of recognition that every society has its advantages and disadvantages all across the world. So that kind of more open thinking is going on even in the early Victorian period. So I haven't actually been able to find an awful lot of support for the claim that women were encouraged to believe that wearing corsets was good for them, that it was beneficial for their health. Although, as I say, some modern commentators have claimed this and said this, that women were kind of encouraged by doctors, who of course were all men. I haven't been able to find much support for that. All the records that I've looked at basically, they are condemning those tight corsets. They're saying that they're damaging to the health, although they do allow that there are some situations in which they might be acceptable up to a point. For example, to the woman whose waning charms set in an exuberance of flesh, in other words, to a woman who's getting older and getting fat, perhaps the support of this adventitious aid is an advantage, but in that case its suffering should rather be cord quilted in the lining or very thin whalebone than either steel or iron. Don't use those, very tough little eyelets. And in all situations, the bodice being just another name for the corset, the bodice should be flexible to the motion of the body and the undulations in the shape. It should never be felt to press upon any part. So even in cases where there might be some health benefit, it should never be too tight. Okay, so that's the kind of recommendation that people were making in those days, that doctors were making, and so on. And it goes on to say, let the padded corset rectify the defects of the deformed. I mean, there are some people whose backs might be weak, for example, and there are arguments even today that wearing a corset for a man or a woman could strengthen the back. But where nature has given the outline of a well-constructed form, forbear to traverse her designs. Just let nature do its job and don't try to force the body in unnatural ways. Youth should be left to spring up, unconfined like the young cedar. The cedar is a tree. Young people should just be allowed to grow as trees do, naturally. And when the hand of man or accident does not distort the pliant stem, it will grow erect and firm, spreading its beautiful and cheerful shade over the heads of its planters. So just like a tree, if you let the body just develop in its own way, it will be strong, it will be healthy. You don't need forcing the body through corsets or that kind of procedure. That's from the Mirror of the Graces, which was published in 1830. It would be a pretty typical sort of comment from that period. And just, in a few cases, there might be the idea that, well, this is a new design of corset. This is healthier. So you get an elastic corset coming in, like that. And the description of it is saying, we don't recommend corsets. We think corsets are a terrible thing in general, but here at last is a corset that's got a design that's flexible for the body. And this one we can say, well, this makes a change from the kind of corset we've normally seen. We could say that it's something that we can recommend. At the bottom here, the evils attendant upon the system of tight lacing have been over and over again pointed out in the Lancet. The Lancet is a medical journal, still is the #1 journal for medical research and for publications about advances in that whole area of health and medicine. So the Lancet has over and over again talked about how corsets are bad. So I'm keeping on pushing this message. No, doctors were not recommending the health benefits of corsets. Just very occasionally something might come along and they say, well, this one's got an advantage, it's elastic, it's flexible, this sort of thing. Or certain people who might have a weak spine and that sort of thing, they might be able to benefit from the use of a corset, but not in general. It's not something that the medical profession is going to support. So it's contrasted with the evils attendant on tight lacing. It's a healthier alternative. All right. So just to sum up what I've said in the last 20 minutes or so, the literature of the period doesn't really show men directly forcing or encouraging women to wear corsets. It's not something that you're normally going to find, as far as I could see, in the literature of that time. But, you know, perhaps there's another kind of persuasion, a subtler kind of persuasion going on. Rather than directly recommending women to wear corsets, is there some kind of social pressure? I mean, after all, nearly every woman wore one in those days. Even when they were in the workhouse or in prison, they were issued corsets. So it was considered to be basic for women to wear them, although there would be a difference between a tight corset, you know, with that lacing pulled very, very tightly, and just something that was worn much more loosely. Well, obviously the whole subject is related to sex, because clothing is part of how people present their bodies, and there's a sort of sexual element involved. So how would that play out in the Victorian period, or in the is particularly interested in the earlier part of the 19th century? If we look at the fictional writing, we can find that the corset quite often comes along in sexual contexts. They usually call it a bodice. I don't know, in that context it seems to be the preferred word, and it's part of the beautiful woman's dress. It's all they'll describe various aspects of the beautiful woman, and they'll almost always include a description of the corset as part of it. The corset was not, although we think of it today as an undergarment, it would sometimes be worn as just by itself, without a shirt on top or anything. So it would be visible, or the shirt might be open at the front, and the corset would be visible. And so you get things like this. The Keepsake is a rather famous journal of romantic fiction. It's full of those kinds of stories where servant girls end up marrying the master of the house, or gallant gentlemen find young women and marry them. In real life, they're more likely to, you know, make love to them and leave them. But in the romantic fiction, there's a lot of descriptions of lower class women being married off to upper class men. For example, a beautiful 15-year-old peasant girl. You've got all the descriptions of her young blood and her throat round and without the string of red beads, because she's vain. She wants to make herself beautiful. And then her bodice, open in front, is of crimson stuff, fancifully slashed and embroidered. And then her petticoat and so on. So it just... part of the description of how beautiful the girl is includes the bodice. And this would be typical. And this is a very young girl. All right, she's only 15. And that's something to think about, because corsets were considered particularly damaging to young women. From a medical point of view, the doctors would say, look, for goodness sake, even if adults are going to wear these things, you should not be giving them to children. If we wish our young ladies, okay, from one account, to possess health, fresh complexions, stout nerves, and exhilarating spirits, we must recommend the abolishing of that useless, cumbersome, unnatural, and mischievous piece of dress, yclept means called stays, corsets, or bodice, till they have attained at least their 20th year. So this kind of fiction where a girl as young as 15 is wearing a bodice, it's showing that there's a sort of pressure on women to conform to certain idea of what would make a woman beautiful. And even from the age, in this case, from the age of 15, the girl is shown as wearing a bodice. So, okay, the doctors may not be recommending these corsets and this type of clothing, but the way that young beauties are shown in romantic fiction and in paintings as well, they're giving a different kind of message. The message is, if you want to look good, you've got to wear one of these. Okay, so that's the kind of pressure that you might want to look at if you're thinking about how that clothing works. And so that ties it in very importantly with the romantic fiction of the period. So for students of literature, that's particularly relevant. And it's not such a different message. If you look at these pictures that you've got in fashion magazines from the Victorian period, okay, the clothing is different, but the message is not so different from the message you're getting today. And what is the message? Skinny is beautiful. Thin is a model, isn't it? That's what the fashion magazines are pumping at women today. I mean, you've got the same debate is going on, really, isn't it? People are saying, these fashion parades that they have in Paris, or these big fashion shows that they are damaging to women because they're presenting a stereotype of the body that is not, frankly, not healthy. And it leads them to illnesses, and it's causing stress in young women, it's causing diseases and so on. It's to a certain extent, it's the same debate that's still going on, all right? You know, maybe the waistlines aren't quite as impossibly thin today as they were in Victorian times, but the basic issues are still there. You've got doctors and sensible people saying, you know, the skinny look is not a good look, it's not a healthy look. But it remains the society's paradigm. It's the model that you get in a lot of the fashion magazines and so on. And young women, you know, they go for it. They accept. They see that's the aim, and that's what I shall, you know, try to achieve for my body. Of course, these days you've got Photoshop. All right. Okay. You can see in those days they would squeeze the body into a whalebone corset, but in our times we've got Photoshop, and of course. Some of those pictures that we saw, you know, also would have been doctored. They'll show an unrealistically narrow waist for a woman in the Victorian period as well. But it's kind of becoming notorious that quite a lot of the pictures that they show in fashion magazines are, this is an extreme example, okay, but quite a lot of those, in fact, most of those photographs that you see in fashion magazines have been touched up. They've just taken out an extra little bit of flesh. They've taken out a little line here or a curve here to make the body look more kind of skinny, well, following that sort of paradigm. So in some ways things haven't changed very much, but it does open up the topic in a different sort of direction now. And well, we've been talking about the corset for half an hour. I might try and get a little break in. Just a minute. Yeah. Okay, carry on for a few minutes, and then I'll give you a break on this, and we can kind of have a breather and think about where we've got to so far. But the kinds of health risks also. Just as if you look at it, there's an important difference between the modern approach to skinniness, to thinness, and the Victorian approach. And in the same way, the health risks involved have changed. Because what's happening is that the emphasis is changing from using clothing to force the body into a particular shape to using dieting. It's a different approach, isn't it? And there she goes. Do you want to see her again? Okay, it's lovely. You get that in so many old movies, where the woman, she faints. Okay, now how many of you have been faced with a shocking situation and gone, oh? It doesn't happen, does it? I mean, women don't do that anymore. But you're reading about it all the time in the fiction of the Victorian period. Okay, and not just in the fiction. Here's a real scene. All right, an actress performing Desdemona's death scene from Othello, and she faints. And the actor himself, Othello, the actor Othello, writes about it. I sprang from the stage. I rushed to the bed because they had to take her off the stage and up to a bedroom. But she moved not, stirred not. There she lay, pale as her sheets, unconscious as the grave. Water, for heaven's sake, water, I shrieked. Water was brought, and her hands and temples were bathed with it. The kind wife of the manager held smelling salts to her nostrils and endeavoured to force sal volatile and water through her teeth. At length, she slowly opened her eyes, gave a sigh, and a burst of hysterics followed. Okay, she starts kind of screaming or crying and shouting out. Thank God, I exclaimed, for I knew then she was safe. In this state, she was carried, wrapped up, to the green room, presumably a room where they kind of kept people who were not well. Her corset was cut, a physician was sent for, and she was sufficiently recovered to be sent to her lodgings in a carriage. But the story does not have a happy ending. Just a few days later, she died. Okay? Now, all right, it would be too much to say that it was the fact that she was wearing a corset that killed her, but still, medical research shows that women who are wearing corsets are breathing about 10% less oxygen. They're getting about 10% less air into themselves because the corset prevents them kind of from inhaling deeply. So fainting is obviously that would be an explanation, wouldn't it, for the increased amount of fainting that you get, or the extraordinary amount of fainting you get going on in Victorian novels and so on, and that you see in those old movies. Of course, they're from the 1920s or so, but it's the same idea because the corset continued to be in use into the early 20th century as well. So there seems to be some kind of link between the corset and the fact that women in those 19th century novels are constantly fainting whenever there's something shocking going on. They faint and they have to use smelling salts to wake them up again. Oh dear, we seem to have lost. I've lost the recording. No, I haven't. Okay. All right. So, yeah. If you're looking at dieting as a model for getting the body into that supposed perfect shape for a woman, then you're looking at illnesses like anorexia, where people kind of compulsively, sort of neurotically don't eat food in the normal way. And this is something that has quite a long history going back at least to the Middle Ages. It was first diagnosed in Victorian times and became, in the later 19th century, something that was in the medical records. But you can actually find it going on in like medieval accounts. Not always women either. In those early accounts, it was sort of a fairly equal balance between men and women, and it seems to have been a rather different thing from what we think of today. Because in the earlier period, the medieval period, the early modern period, and even in the Victorian period, dieting, to that extreme extent, excessive fasting, has been more of a religious thing. It's more connected with religious sentiment, it's more connected with spiritual purity. It hasn't been something that people do for reasons of fashion until the 20th century, as far as we can see. So dieting has a sort of spiritual side to it in its historical origins. And it seems only in recent times that it's become linked to fashion and body image. So one of the famous cases is Elizabeth Squirrel, whose autobiography was written when she was just 14 years old. People felt she was a very extraordinary child, and she wrote an account of her life, which you can take a look at here if you like. It's a rather difficult book to get hold of. There aren't very many copies around, so look at it carefully. I know it's a bit of an old just looks like an old book. Well, it is just an old book, but it's her story of how she developed like this, and it's based on spirituality. Here's a drawing of her at the age of 13, and apparently she went without food for months and months and months and months and months. And the reasons were not, to make herself look beautiful or related to kind of fashion in any way. It was a sort of spiritual thing for her. Somehow she'd got to the point where she regarded taking in food as somehow impure. And her doctor supported her. In fact, her doctor helped her to edit and publish that book, and writes a long recommendation of her at the end, saying that he really believes her story is true. And another religious writer of the period, David Goyder, who published books on the Bible and things like that, believes her to be in communication with angels. So her dieting, her extreme dieting, is of a sort of spiritual nature, just like the medieval saints who would fast for long periods as a form of spiritual purification. Let's check. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what I've done here. Yeah. Oh yes, sorry, this is a quotation. All of this is a quotation from another researcher. She sums up other people's research. She talks about David Kunzel, who wrote a book about the corset, and that he looks at post-Reformation painful feminine bodily sculpture as a secularization of medieval penitential practices. In other words, for him, the corset is a sort of secularized version of the hair shirt. And he notes that the corset comes from the Protestant secularization of pain, that for Catholics, pain was much more closely connected with religious experience. But once you got the Reformation, the Puritans and the Protestants tended to sort of separate out pain. It's not part of God's plan. Whereas for the Catholics and some of the early modern Protestants, pain was part of God's plan. But it becomes secular in Protestant culture. It becomes separated from religion in Protestant culture. And that leads to, in Kunzel's analysis, it leads to the development of the corset as a sort of fashion item. And you've got another researcher, Valerie Steele, who's sharing the basic conclusions of Kunzel and saying that the symbols of oppression, the corset, the high-heeled shoe, the bustle, various, not just the corset, I focused on the corset, but various kinds of constrictive clothing were actually semantically turned into symbols of domination over males. You see, when you wore the hair shirt, you gave yourself a kind of status, a kind of confidence. I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing this for God. And that kind of feeling gets pushed over into constrictive clothing. So Victorian fashion, and this is an interesting point, it wasn't the feminists who were against the fashion, it was the Puritans, according to this analysis. And it's doubtful that women's emancipation went hand in hand with the elimination of the cumbersome Victorian attire. So we see feminism growing up, and at the same time as feminism really starts to develop in the later part of the 19th century, the corset starts to fall out of use. So people have tended to put those two things together. They've said that people stop wearing corsets, women stop wearing corsets when they get a sense of feminism and a sense of freedom. And they stop wearing the corset. But here it says that that is a doubtful analysis. That's actually the fact that the two things were happening at the same time, according to Joan Culianu, following Kunzel and Steele, think that that's actually probably not the right way of looking at it. They happen at the same time, but they're not necessarily connected in that way. So rather than saying that the corset is related to the straitjacket, is more, according to that analysis, is more closely related to the hair shirt. Okay? Not the straight jacket, but the hair shirt. Well, several researchers have kind of been coming to that kind of conclusion. Are they right? Well, the question of whether they're right or not is maybe a different kind of question. But it's certainly an interesting way of looking at it. So, rather than seeing the corset as a form of male oppression of women, and as I've said, we haven't really seen that doctors, as representatives of men, were recommending women to wear these corsets, it makes more sense to these researchers to see the corset as an assertion of female identity. Women are actually saying, this is who I am, through the corset. So it's a sort of, rather than being oppressive, it's a form of empowerment. So it's kind of the opposite, really. So you've got the spiritual aims of hair shirts, you've got the spiritual aims of fasting, and they're transforming themselves in a secular society into fashion-conscious aims of corsets and dieting. And that's the way that a number of researchers are seeing the history of this. All right? And if you're following that analysis, then all of those doctors that I was mentioning earlier on, who I was citing their opinions against the corset, their real reason wasn't, according to this analysis, their real reason wasn't just from the point of view of health. Their real reason is that they are more like puritanical, prudish people, and they feel threatened by the female body being sexualized publicly in the way that the corset did. So the open message, the message you read, is that corsets are bad for your health, but hidden behind that was the message of, I'm ashamed to look at women's bodies like that. That's terrible. I feel very threatened by women doing that. I wish they wouldn't do it. All right, so that's the way that some researchers are understanding the messages of health warnings. And they're saying that the corset wasn't that harmful, but doctors were exaggerating it so much. Why did they exaggerate it? Because they felt threatened by it. In other words, the corset is a symbol not of oppression, but a symbol of empowerment. Okay, it's the exact opposite, really. Okay, we've got two quite different and contrary views going on here. We've got some people seeing it as a symbol of male oppression, and others seeing it as an assertion of female domination. Well, can they both be right? Maybe, you know, it would seem that they can't both be right, but I'm going to look into it just a little bit more and see whether there's some way of reconciling those two apparently contradictory views. And I'll just sort of break off from the actual topic of corsets here for a minute to talk about the meta topic, which is that you people are going to be writing a paper for me. Right? And when you write a paper, this is the kind of thing that you need to be looking for. There are two different and contrary viewpoints of something. Not necessarily contrary, but there are two different ways of looking at it. Maybe even 3 or 4 different ways of looking at it. Okay? Try to find out what the different angles are, the different perspectives. See, some people are arguing this way, some people are arguing another point of view in a different way. Focus on that. Show what the argument is, and show what you think is the right answer to that argument. Should we try to put the two arguments together to make a bigger picture? Should we agree with one side or disagree with another side? What's your analysis of that argument? That's the right approach to writing an academic paper. Okay, so I want to look at the way we've arrived here at seeing that there are two different analyses of something. Okay, and that's what research should throw up. Okay, and when research throws something up like that, that's where we know right, this is where I can get my teeth in and write my academic paper. So just to kind of remind, since you will be writing your papers for me now, just to remind you that that's the kind of approach that I'd be looking for. To coming to the point where you could find some kind of disagreement among people who've really researched the subject and thought about it, and exploring their disagreement and the reasons for their disagreement. Okay then, back to the topic, and can they both be right? Is it a symbol of male oppression, or is it an assertion of female domination? Let me try and sum up what I think maybe is going on here. Culianu, who I quoted there commenting on Kunzel and Steele, she says quite cleverly, I think, she makes the point that clothing covers up one part and it uncovers another part. In other words, you know, by wearing something that covers my body from here to here, I'm exposing this part. Okay, some bits are covered and some bits are exposed. The bits that are covered are leaving other bits. Can you see how clothing works in that sense? It covers up one part, but that leaves another part uncovered. In the same way, that analysis covers one side, saying it's all about female empowerment, kind of focuses on one side of the argument, and that ignores the other side of the argument. So I thought that was a rather clever comment of Culianu on comparing the critical analysis with the actual clothing itself. Looking at that a little bit more closely, you could say that yes, for some women, the corset would be a powerful symbol of female sexuality. And interestingly, and Kunzel is the one who emphasizes this, it's combined with unavailability, because it's like a kind of armor protecting the woman. You know, it shows off the female body, but it shields it from access. Okay, you can look, but you can't touch. All right, so for some women, the corset would have worked like that. But for others, they must have felt like they were a square peg being fitted into a round hole. That there's a social expectation that they wear this horrible garment, and it constrained their bodies, it didn't suit them. A little bit like today when you see people, you think, oh, she's wearing that because it's the fashion. It totally doesn't suit her. It's not what's right for her shape, her body, but she's wearing it because it's the fashion. Okay, you know how, I don't see it so much these days, but when I first came to Japan, if something was the fashion, everybody would be wearing it. And yes, but it suits some people. It doesn't suit everybody. Why are you making yourself a slave to that sort of fashion? But in the same way, the corset was a kind of enslaving certain women because it wasn't the right thing for it. They looked awkward. They looked awful in them. And they couldn't reach that level of that. Their bodies weren't like that. Their bodies needed something else. But so it would have worked. It's too simple to say that it works one way for everybody. It isn't a one-size-fits-all situation, is it? You've got different types of women, different shapes of body, and also different psychologies. And for some women, it might have worked in one way, and for other women, it would have worked in a very different and opposite way. So I think you can say that both answers are possible. That it is, at the same time, oppressive for some women and empowering for others. So we can't just reconstruct it as a symbol of female empowerment. We'd have to see, to a certain extent, there's an element of oppression there for some women. It's not going to work like that. And in the same way, the arguments against corsets, because these analysts, these researchers, are saying that those people who gave health warnings against corsets were only doing it out of prudishness, that they felt threatened by the sexualized female body. And again, I don't think you can 100% say that either. Because although corsets, when worn properly, can be beneficial, and even today, as I say, there is a sort of medical application for a corset, the more extreme claims of the dangers of corsets also, well, you know, they were scaremongering. As I say, it wouldn't cause consumption. It wouldn't cause some of the diseases that they said it would cause. So they were scaremongering. But that's a little bit like dieting. If you did a certain amount of dieting, well, that would be healthy for you. But if you took it to extremes, it would be harmful. And the same thing would go for the corset. If it was worn in an appropriate way that was suitable to the body of that particular person, it might have some benefits. But if it's used routinely, we saw, you know, that tight corseting where they push the woman and pull the strings as tight as they could to try and make the waist unnaturally narrow, well, obviously that would be harmful. So there would be some health risks. It's not all just about saying that you find the female body threatening. There objectively were certain health risks involved. So just to wind that up, what I found by researching this subject, which I initially, I'll tell you frankly, when I started doing this, I thought this would just be part of the presentation for today. But as I looked at it more and more deeply, I realized there was so much to be said that it kind of took over and became the whole presentation. It's much more complicated. The symbology of the corset is much more complicated, certainly than I had imagined before I started preparing this presentation. I didn't imagine that there would be so much there. We can see that the old religious ideas, the penitential practices. Penitential means doing something for spiritual purification or to say sorry for the bad things that you've done. These practices gave the penitent, the person who did them, the person who fasted, the person who wore a hair shirt, had a certain moral authority. I'm doing this for God. And this transfers itself to dieting and restrictive clothing. People don't say I'm doing it for God, but they do feel a sort of, you know, they feel a certain pride. They're doing the right thing. I mean, believe me, I've got an 18-year-old daughter. I know how she feels about these things. That it's not a spiritual feeling in the way that it was, but it's a strong feeling that this is the right thing to do. This is how I should, you know, this is how I should respect my body and myself, and this is what I should do. So if people are relating to the corset in that way, it's obviously not oppressive. People are taking pride in it. They feel that that's what they should be doing with their in order to respect themselves properly. So on the other hand, you've got dieting and clothing that it can be a challenge to Puritan values, and it can also challenge male hegemony. So at the one hand, it can challenge those men who feel, oh goodness, that's too much. It's too in my face. I can't accept, you know, the woman's body being presented in that way. And it's also a challenge to the domination, the hegemony, the power of men in society, because instead of women, and this is a very important point actually, rather than women being the ones who have to hide their sexuality behind clothing, it's the men who are obliged to control their sexual impulses. In our modern world, I think the contrast with Arabic culture would be obvious. I mean, when I was many years ago working in a language school and there were Arabic students, and they would sometimes say to me, I don't know where to look. What should I do? I don't know where to look. In my country, women don't show their legs. Women don't show their, you know, women are covered. Okay? And our society is sort of saying, well, you as a man are the one who has to control yourself. Okay, so that's kind of putting limitations on men in order to give a freedom to women through clothing. I bet that's something you never thought about. Okay, but it's a very interesting idea, isn't it? that it's the woman who's being given a freedom here to express herself, and it's the man who's expected to kind of control his sexual impulses in that situation. Whereas in Arabic culture, as you know, it's still largely the other way around. Men are expected, men are men. They can't be expected to control themselves. Therefore, women have to cover themselves up. Okay, it's taking an opposite view of the situation. So, finally then, like all fashions, like all clothing of any kind, the corset imposes itself on the body, and it's a double-edged thing. For some, it's a tool of empowerment, but for others, it's going to be a form of tyranny. So I would say that yes, both analyses are, in this case, appropriate. Although I would not just say one analysis or the other, but I would say you have to take them both together. You have to say it is both. All right. So that would be the kind of conclusion that I would reach after looking into this subject. Okay. That's the end of that.